My name is Garett Nickelo, and I teach out of Screencastify Central. And what I want to look at and what I want to talk about today is the concept of virtual labs for distance education. And so what I mean by distance education was essentially the last semester, if you will, think about it that way, during the pandemic. And what I want to take a look at is exactly what I went up doing and what I had to do to really try to set that up. Now, before I actually get started, I do want to make an acknowledgement that I live and teach in Mi'kma'ki, which would be the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So in today's presentation, just a few things that we're going to take a look at. So just a kind of generalized introduction and a quick about me. Now, it's going to be a little bit different than what Chris had mentioned about me, but it's merely just for the context of this presentation. I do have a quick little discussion point, and that's going to use a little bit of technology. If you happen to have something near you, whether it's the computer in front of you or device, that'll be fine. Take a look at how virtual labs actually went in this past year and what exactly did I wind up using in order to run that. And then being a scientist, take a look at some results, just some qualitative results that I wound up seeing and witnessing over the few months that we had. Moving forward, what exactly can I anticipate the coming year to kind of look like? And finally, I'm going to leave you with an asynchronous activity that can be done at your leisure and at least would give you an idea of some of the virtual labs that I'm doing. So for me, I've always been interested in virtual labs, mainly because as a high school teacher, there are concepts that are particularly difficult to have students buy in. Not every student is a science student, and some are taking it because they have to. In other words, perhaps they need a prerequisite course in order to get into their desired program. But virtual labs help connect that. It helps bridge the idea that science is accessible by anybody. And of course, with the last few months and the pandemic, that really changed how I wound up doing virtual labs, as well as the frequency. Typically in a year, I'd wind up doing only a handful to really cover the real abstract concepts. But really, when it came down to it, I really had to try to find some way to tie everything together. Usually hands-on labs would be the way, and I'm always interested in trying to maintain any lab work that I would have on the go anyway, and so virtual labs were that sort of way of doing that. So for me, my courses that I wound up teaching during my time of the distance education period, I wound up teaching some Science 10, and this is Cobequid Educational Centre's pre-IB program, and grade 11 and grade 12 chemistry. So if you're familiar with any of those courses, you probably know that there's lots of opportunities for activities and laboratory experiments. Now, where it gets kind of tricky in terms of what I did and where we're going is that with the International Baccalaureate or IB program, there are mandatory lab hours. And so it actually has to be incorporated in there. The other courses, it's not necessarily mandatory, although suggested. But with the IB, it makes it especially more challenging. Now, again, with me, I enjoy technology anyways, and a lot of kids these days are really strong with technology, and it's a nice way of merging science with the tech and getting kids hands-on and minds-on, but in a different way. Now, what I'm going to do really, really quickly is posing this quick discussion question. I'm hoping this is going to work because I'm trying to do this for the first time. I'm going to ask you a question here, and we're going to use something that I wound up using in conjunction with the virtual labs themselves called Mentimeter. And what it is just an online polling app. And you can use any device that you have on hand. And hopefully you've had a chance to read that while I'm just kind of describing that. So what do you think is the value of having laboratory activities and experiments? And that could be actually a virtual lab. It could be just your regular old lab that you wind up doing in front of you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open hopefully another tab if I can get this going okay. There we go. And so what if you're going to participate, this is actually going to show us some live feedback. And you can go up the very top and you'll see the address, www.menti.com. And what it'll do, it'll take you to this page where it asks you to enter a code in. And so my code is 836928. And all that's going to wind up doing is presenting you with options. And these are just options that I've just selected just to see and get the ball rolling. So if you want to participate in that, feel free to do that. And I'll just give a few seconds. And as you wind up doing that, it should wind up, there we go. And you should see the options presented in front of you. And just to get an idea from the crowd, what does everybody think? Now you can access this at any time as long as I have the actual poll continually running. So I'm just going to skip away from. I'm going to switch because I have a second question, a second discussion question, and this is probably going to be a little bit of out of order than what's in my presentation, but just a second question, just to try to get a feel for everybody. And again, if you missed this opportunity, you can always go back and vote later. So because I don't know the members currently in the room, I'm just curious to see what exactly has been your experience delivering any kind of virtual labs, experiments, activities, that sort of thing. So you don't have to just limit this one to labs and experiments. And it's absolutely okay if you have no experience at all. So keep in mind activities, that's actually fine as well. Now, if you are using a device, you should see that the question isn't in fact changed as long as you haven't closed out of your tab or your window. Okay, and again, I'll just to get an idea. So a lot with no experience, and that's absolutely fine. So again, this is just continually running, and you can go off and vote at any time. Later as well, when I upload these slides, I'll put a link, and if you're curious, you can actually see the end results to that. Okay, so in the past year, as I've mentioned before, there are particular courses I taught, but just to kind of give you the full perspective, my first semester course load, what did that look like? Well, I pretty much only taught Chemistry 11, and that wasn't too bad. However, I did in fact have a section of IB chemistry, and if you can remember what I had previously mentioned, IB chemistry has mandatory virtual labs, or sorry, mandatory laboratory experiments. Now, I was fortunate in the sense that in semester one, it went uninterrupted, and I was able to complete all of my work hands-on live in the classroom. However, things changed. I also wound up sharing this course with another teacher who wound up taking it over from me in second semester. And I know him and we kind of piggybacked back and forth about what would actually work and what could be done. Chemistry 11 academic, so same idea. They were live in front of me, not a big deal. It was second semester where it actually changed though. So in second semester, I had this course load, so pre-IB Science 10, Chemistry 11, and Chemistry 12. And so laboratory activities, experiments are radically different, and they kind of build off of each other. So for me, when I teach Science 10, there's a lot of skills, introductory skills that I wind up teaching to students. They're able to take that through to any of the sciences they wind up taking, particularly Chemistry 11, as I teach that, and then what they learn in Chemistry 11 they take forward to Chem 12. Now, it made it a little bit challenging this year. If you wind up looking at what I have here on the right, this is just kind of a snapshot of my Google Classroom. And you can see that I would have a virtual lab kind of just thrown in there somewhere. But the idea was to try to keep that going for the topic at hand. So what I wound up using in order to deliver these virtual labs, and I'm just kind of highlighting what I went up using and what was successful for me. So the very first thing that I went up using was something that's commonly referred to as your FET or your FET simulations. And I'm going to go into that in detail. I went up looking at something else called the physics aviary, and that was something that was mentioned to me, and I was having difficulty trying to come up with activities and some sort of tie-in to the physics portion of grade 10 science, and this was mentioned to me, and so I thought I'd try it, and it was very successful. I also used two other things, and you'll see why and where I use those, something called quizzes and something as well called Screencastify. So what FET is a series of simulations, and they cover primarily science, usually chemistry and physics, but they're starting to sprout up in other disciplines, such as math as well. These things are very, very neat, and that's because they're free to use, and there's a variety of ways you can actually use them. So depending on what you're browsing in, you could use that from. So if you have a computer in front of you, like I'm using a laptop right now, I could easily bring up this simulation and run it. You also have the option of downloading it as well. So if you are limited by time or internet or data, you could download it and then you can actually run it off of your device later. Now, one thing just to note is that FET is not listed in the approved list for all of the RCEs and CSAP, and that's only because it is in fact approved for everybody. So you won't actually see that in the list if you've seen that document. And one of the big things for FET, of course, is that there's already many existing activities, so you can go off and run that right away. This screen is just a very, very simplistic shot of one of the activities that I wound up using. It's very, very accessible. You can see that it's fairly user-friendly, and pretty much everything that you see on the screen is active. So this is only a screen grab, so I can't really do anything with it. But if I wanted to shake that shaker, I could do that. You can see that there's a faucet, so I can let water, in this case, in there. See, there's a little drop-down menu for your solute, so I can change whatever chemical I want. You can change it whether it's a solid or a solution. There's this little magnifying tool, which simply gives you the concentration. In the case of this, you can evaporate some of the liquid that's in the container. You could remove some of the solute. You could even drain it out here. And then, of course, there's a little button down here to reset. And a lot of the simulations are kind of along the same lines. Very, very interactive, fairly simplistic, but enough to capture the mind and let a student kind of wander around and really play. Now, unfortunately, there are some problems with FET, and there was one that I encountered this semester, and I wasn't actually anticipating it, mainly because I wasn't really thinking about it at all. Not only were we in the pandemic, but from a teaching perspective, I was in crisis mode, trying to troubleshoot things day in, day out. And it turns out that not all FET activities are actually digitally accessible. And one of the main reasons why how I found that out, for me, I have a variety of devices, so it wasn't a problem from my side of things. Now, that being said, when I would try out some of these activities, I'd run them on my desktop computer, no problem, not an issue at all. But it totally slipped my mind that a lot of students were actually relying on their cell phone. In some cases, that was their only means for accessing any of these activities. In some cases, it was like something that could be borrowed from somebody else. But a lot of them actually relied on their cell phone, and that actually created some problems. Now, here's why. And I'm not really a technical person at all. Underneath all of the simulations under FEIT, it would actually indicate how you could actually run these simulations and how they would actually work. So one of the most common ones there was Java, if you're familiar with that. A lot of things currently run off of Java. There was another method, and that's what this kind of top arrow is pointing at here. You'll see these two little markers. However, one of the problem that I encountered was one of the simulations that I wanted to use that was really, really good wouldn't run off the phone. And in order to run off of the phone, what I actually needed was the second arrow was pointing at. So I needed this version here, which I believe is known as HTML5. And you don't have to really worry about what that means. All you really need to know is that it worked on the phone. And when I went up assigning a particular virtual lab, I had a couple of emails saying, Mr. Nickelo, I can't run this. What should I do? What should I do? And it turns out that FEIT is actually in the process of converting everything over to HTML5 in order for the accessibility to be available for everybody. So what did I wind up doing? Well, I wound up using this this little app, and you could use this as an extension for Chrome called Screencastify. And perhaps several of you are accustomed to Screencastify. Maybe you know what that is, but essentially what it is a little, I guess, extension that allows you to record whatever's on your screen into video. And Screencastify, as well as many other companies, were allowing you to have the free version for use during the period of distance education. And so regularly, Screencastify would only allow a 5-minute maximum amount of time video. You would record it and it would store for you, and then you could do what you wanted with that video. You could edit it, you could upload it somewhere, what have you. During the distance portion, it was actually unlimited. We could actually use as much time as we wanted to. And so I thought, how could I actually use that in conjunction with my virtual labs? And so what I decided to do was I went up actually running the lab myself and recording it. And it was a little bit of work to do that. However, it still allowed accessibility. So Screencastify enabled me to allow the accessibility for all of my students. Now, would I do it again this way? Probably not, at least now knowing what I know. The Physics Aviary is another platform that I wound up using. So I use this one with grade 10. Now, one thing that's a little bit different than the FEIT is that this primarily has to do with physics. You could argue that there's some chemistry there as well. So for me, in grade 10 science, there is a unit that covers kinematics, or motion, physics of motion. And so I needed something for grade 10 in order to try to make everything work, especially knowing that next year, so 2021, we could in fact be doing a lot of virtual labs. So I needed some way of trying to tie in, bridging the gap of some activities in grade 10. And so what could they expect in grade 11? And still try to reinforce the material that we went up doing in class and online. So with the Physics Aviary, there's a number of good things about it. All of the simulations are interactive, maybe not to the same extent as your FEIT, but they're fairly interactive as well. Many of them are very open-ended, and so there's a lot of things you could actually do right away. Now that's great if, of course, you have lots of ideas, that open-endedness, but it could also be a con, and we'll get to that in a second. The Physics Aviary also contains a whole lot of games, so you can actually go in and you can actually just play games, and that's really, really good if you're trying to gamify, if you will, a particular course or concept and have students try to make the most out of it. And then, like I'd mentioned, it's pretty much many branches of physics. You could argue a little bit of chemistry in there, but this is primarily for physics. Your cons, and this is coming from me asking some students some feedback about it. A lot of the visuals are simplified, and up there in the top right-hand corner is just a screen grab of one of the activities. Fairly simplistic. It's not necessarily as free-flowing as FEIT, but everything's there. Resources are not readily available. With FEIT, there's a ton of resources out there. FEIT actually also hosts some resources that people have submitted, other teachers have submitted. Whereas the physics aviary does not necessarily have that. And that's kind of where that open-endedness can be both good and bad. Bad in the sense that, well, if you don't have anything, you're going to have to try to come up with something, particularly if it's an activity that you like. Finally, it's actually not as intuitive. With the physics aviary, as well as many things online, you know that if you wind up moving your mouse a little bit, your pointer will actually change. And unfortunately, with the physics aviary, it doesn't actually change. It just keeps that, if you have it as the default white arrow, it just stays as the white arrow. And you're not really sure if you're going to change it or not. You actually have to test click it and you'll see. Just as a quick note, this isn't actually on any of the RCE or CSAP lists. And that might be something that could warrant some further investigation down the road. Here's just another quick screen grab. And so you can kind of see this one is fairly low key. It's very, very small, this activity. You can see you have a desktop and a touch, or if you want to think about it as your iPad tablet version, you can do that. And they operate more or less the same. And you can kind of see how it does, in fact, look a little bit more low tech. That's because if you click the desktop, you will just get that big screen. Now, from the virtual standpoint, one thing that was typically done is, at least to try to match what I do in person, is some sort of formative assessment in there. What's actually going on? What are the kids getting out of it? And so I was trying to come up with some way outside from Google Forms that would try to make things a little bit easier on myself. And what I went up using was something that's called quizzes. And in case you don't have that in front of you, just listening to the audio, it's spelled a little bit differently there. And I wound up using that quite a bit with my virtual labs, primarily as a formative piece, but in some cases as summative as well. There's a lot of big pros to it if you've never heard of this at all. So there's a lot of pre-made forms already out there. And so if you were to join up, you could actually go in, search up whatever topic you want, and it's likely going to be there. I think there was a particular activity where I was trying to look up something just as a kind of a formative check for one of my concepts that I had taught via online. And I think I had 10,000 hits just on that one topic alone. With quizzes, when you end up deciding what you're going to use, it comes in a variety of different formats, and you can kind of choose what that's going to be. So you can actually get a multiple choice, a formative or summative assessment, however you wish to use it. True and false, have students write a paragraph or a sentence, and there's a whole lot of other options. Personally, I ended up using multiple choice and the sentence options a few times. What's nice too is that you can actually edit them. So if you find something that you kind of like, you could also edit it as you go. And the big pro for me to try to make life easy was that it actually integrates seamlessly into Google Classroom. So if you were or are using Google Classroom, quizzes, and it's not just for science courses, it integrates seamlessly. So it can actually mark things instantly right in front of the student. They can get your feedback, you can get the feedback, and also spits it into your Google Classroom and the gradebook there. A couple of cons here, just if you haven't ever used quizzes before. Timelines can actually be a little bit troublesome to try to use. Sometimes there's great, easy agreement between Google Classroom and quizzes. They talk to each other, no problem. Sometimes they don't, at least that's what I found. There is, in fact, a heavy student reliance. So in other words, when the student actually logs in and goes there, it's all up to them to try to navigate. They've got to kind of figure out where they're going. There is a bit of a learning curve to use it initially, but once you get over that curve, it's fairly straightforward. And again, as a con, it's not actually in the approved list. So if you wind up going to that approval list, it's not listed there, and it's probably because it requires some initial registration to get into that. This is just a screenshot, just very, very quickly, of my own profile. And you can see that for me, anytime that you wind up editing stuff, anytime you wind up creating a quizzes, you could actually save them. You can create your own collections. So that's what you can kind of see off to the right-hand side. You might see my chemistry 11, chemistry 12, my Science 10 folders, and the ones in front of you are the ones that were currently used. It also gives you more feedback as to who's actually participated, who hasn't. And so oftentimes, rather than go into my classroom to figure out who's actually participated in this virtual lab or not, I just have to go to this kind of summative, formative idea of quizzes and take a look who's actually played, who hasn't, and then go elsewhere. Now, I am a science teacher, so I'm going to take a look at these quick results. So what did I wind up seeing using these virtual labs over this past semester, we'll call it? Well, it's very, very comparable to what I would see in terms of participation for any kind of experiments in person. A lot of students would participate. Would they ask questions? Not necessarily. The students who you'd figure would ask questions would. Now, one thing just to kind of note is that anytime I wind up using new virtual labs, and so what I mean by that is that it was a new lab for me. So I've never used it in my own teaching. So rather than being live and having hands-on activity, these are virtual labs that I would try to use to hopefully take their place. And when they were completed, kind of varied. So I have beginning, middle, and end. So students would be kind of all over the place when they were trying to complete them. Most often, by late May, I slowly but surely saw a drop off, and maybe you did see that as well in terms of your participation online. But one thing that I did notice was that if there was a series of tasks that students were given to actually attempt, so this could be the virtual lab, it could be a multiple choice quiz, it could be some activity, it could be a project, anything like that, the virtual lab was always chosen first and foremost. It was the one that had the majority of students actually working and having that buy-in. Now, how were the students approaching that? I'm not really sure. Were they actually just going in and saying, well, I'll do this and I'll make it look like I got it done? Or was it something that they were genuinely excited about? And unfortunately, it's kind of where my results end, because I had very, very low turnout in terms of my questionnaires at the very, very end of the course to see what did students think of that delivery of labs. So moving forward, there's a lot of things to think about using virtual labs again. So the very first thing is, what percentage of time will actually be in the classroom? And will we actually be in the classroom at all? And some of us actually know that answer right now. Surely one thing I'm interested in is the incorporation of some more technology and hopefully developing some more activities around my curriculum. So not necessarily using something that's already built, because if you've ever looked online, you'll find that there are things that they kind of hit the mark in general, but it's not necessarily what you would actually want. So a little bit of editing on your part. Now, I included the slide just because it was in fact an update. So I'd created my slideshow, and then this happened on July 22nd. So we in fact know that, at least as of right now, we're going to be back on September 8th. And even with that news, I'm still working ahead, creating virtual labs and trying to test things out and trying to move forward with that for different topics, just in case. And that's only because I don't really know what's going to happen when we're in person in terms of handling glassware, for example, working in groups, that sort of idea. Now, I am interested in trying to make more virtual labs by actually creating videos in my classroom. I'm not really sure when I'll have access to that. But what I mean by that is what I'll call grassroots labs, simply me running a lab, recording that, but say doing a couple of different trials with different amounts and different, say, concentrations or masses, what have you, and then assigning that to students online through distance. Kind of having something that's a little bit more unique so that students can actually see what does a particular piece of glassware look like versus here's what the cartoon image actually is. Now, right now, I'm also investigating some other platforms, and I don't have all the answers for all of these things since I'm just initially starting to explore them. So one thing I've found, at least from the chemistry side of things, something that's called the Chem Collective. And it is in fact a website, and it's there's the address for all these things are at the very, very end of my presentation. The Chem Collective has something that's more, I guess it's more live and it's more real than say FEIT. A lot of the glassware is fairly legitimate and there's actual pictures of chemicals. There's an app that was suggested to me that's called Chemist. I don't know much about it, just a lot of really good reviews. Something I came across the other day is something that's called the titration screen experiment. It's okay if you don't know what that actually is, but what you need to know is that it's actually a nice way of introducing acids and bases. And I know that can be found throughout the curriculum, from the higher grades to the lower. And there's something that a colleague of mine had suggested that's called Explore Learning. And I guess that is a suite of simulations, kind of like along the same lines as FET. And that's something I'm interested in taking a look at and exploring, if you will. As for others, I mean, if you know of any, by all means, please let me know. Send me an email, and I'd love to hear about anything else. Some things that I just thought of in terms of my grassroots approach. How structured is it actually going to be? How open-ended will it actually be? And will I actually have all the supplies available to do what I need to do? I'm not really sure. Can I make actually the good curriculum connections to my curriculum doing the grassroots method? What kind of work is actually going to be required to set it up? And what kind of time will I need to actually go off and develop it? I'm not really sure. It's something I'm willing to take a stab at. And I did make my way home with a couple of thermometers, for example, when we were allowed into our classrooms in June, just with that idea in mind, to try to take a grassroots virtual approach. Now, finally, just before we wrap things up with my presentation, I am going to leave you with this, and this is completely up to you if you want to try it. This is just an asynchronous activity, so you can do it at your leisure. And when I upload my slides, this will be there, so you can do that now if you want. You could do it then. And what I've included are just QR codes there that you can scan. It'll take you directly to the activity itself, so the handout, if you will, on the left, and its address. If you are going to go old school and just type it in, on the right-hand side, that QR code will take you right to the simulation, which is on FET, and it will work on your phone. I tried that one out already, so no issues there. And you can just play around with that if you want to take a look at that. These are the links to some of the things that I've mentioned already. And again, these will be available on the slides a little bit later. So I thank you very much for your attention. And hopefully, if you have no experience, this might encourage you to get out there and investigate things for your own curriculum. There's a lot of things that are out there that can help you fit, both from science, math, and beyond. And I hope something within this presentation you hopefully found interesting. My email is listed there, and I'm always open for conversation, some networking, and collaboration. So thank you so much.